Warning: suicide and death. This content addresses mental health issues, including research and narratives on suicide. Please take care while engaging with it and only proceed if you feel safe doing so. If you or someone you love is having thoughts of suicide, please contact 988. Help is available. Welcome. This is your host, Lisa Meeks. Over the last 3 years, I've had the immense blessing of getting to know John and Jennifer Ruddell. Together, we've worked to produce a special series on medical training and suicide. Our series is dedicated to the memory of Jack Ruddell and to the memory of all medical trainees lost to suicide. His parents, John and Jennifer, and our entire team hope this series sparks new conversations and accelerates policies and practices in medical training that improve learner engagement and help seeking and reduce the drivers that contribute to the erosion of medical trainee well-being. If this is your first introduction to the series, please stop and return to episode 102, where our series and this story begins. There are important contextual items that help our listeners and readers fully appreciate the scope of this issue. Importantly, this is where the story of Jack Ruddell is introduced. We are very grateful to our audience for engaging with this series, and we encourage you to share it broadly. We are also deeply grateful for and indebted to the Ruddell family. Their strength in sharing their son's story is a gift to us all. Throughout this series, they've given us important reminders about where we need to focus, how we need to care for one another, and the need for cultural change. We'll begin with an introduction by our consult psychiatrist and narrator, Dr. Joseph Murray.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Joe Murray, a psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College and a consultant for this series. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that today's episode covers sensitive topics, including suicide and suicidal ideation. The content and research we'll discuss may be distressing for some listeners, so please proceed with caution. If at any point you feel overwhelmed, it's okay to pause and come back when you're ready. If you are struggling with your mental health or having thoughts of suicide, know that help is available. You can call or text 988 to reach the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, where trained professionals are ready to support you. Remember, it's okay to ask for help. You are not alone. In today's episode, we'll explore the devastating impact of student suicide and the often inadequate support from academic institutions. We'll hear from the Ruddell family and experts as we examine how institutions frequently fall short in responding to these tragedies. These losses must prompt us to reflect on how we can create more supportive environments that encourage help seeking and prevent future tragedies. Institutions need to reevaluate their cultures and systems with urgency and care. Our guests will share strategies for navigating the aftermath of a loss and driving proactive change in medical training. This critical conversation aims to break the silence and push for healthier, more supportive institutions. We'll start with the Ruddell family, sharing their experience after the loss of their son.
One of your guests treated the loss of someone to suicide as a mandate for change for his institution. What a refreshing change to see. This proclamation, this acknowledgement that this has to stop. This is a wake-up call. We need to pause and think. And very unfortunately, where Jack attended, it was the exact opposite, unfortunately. It seems to be the common approach, and that is to ascertain whether there's liability involved, to go lightly on discussing it, if at all, and
sweep it under the rug.
To move on. And number one, that's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And number two, it's very offensive to the family. It's dishonoring to the one who's lost. And it's very cruel to the classmates in Jack's case, because the community has lost someone who was a very important part of the community. Jack was at his school in undergrad and med school for 7+ years, a very important part of the community, contributed, participated, I think made things better. And to have his loss go with no acknowledgement, much less a pause to reflect and make change, is beyond belief. How could that happen?
They did honor him with a memorial service, but there wasn't personal interaction between ourselves, our family, with members of the academic community. Jack's friends put it together, and they found the people to help participate.
From the faculty and
staff. And I did not realize that. We were not told that for quite some time. When I found that, it just broke my heart, because I knew that his friends were tortured. They were tortured by the loss of him. And to have to assemble this, contact so many people, and do it on their own was beyond me. And I'm very grateful to them, but was shocked. And again, it was
as if we don't want to be associated with the loss. We don't want any potential liability or any tarnishing of our image. And that was just unbelievable in hindsight. We get clearer and clearer pictures of that. We want to be clear. Jack really admired his teachers and his experience there. He would not want to speak poorly of anyone. He had mentors, and there were individuals who have reached out to us. You know, a wonderful man who's a mentor, and the chaplain who's been so kind, and then others who have been brought on board since Jack's loss who've been really wonderful, including a new dean. But as an institution, and for those who were in leadership positions at the time, it was not disheartening, it was just shameful. And the more time that passes, the more we get perspective on that. And you have to realize that at the time of loss, we and our family and Jack's community of friends were in trauma. We're absolutely traumatized.
Yes, non-functioning.
In the midst of this, we were writing Jack's obituary in our hotel room with his brothers. And you never know what to do. You never imagined yourself in this situation, having to do these things for your son. So any overtures or any assistance was greeted welcome, but we look back and we realized that there was no acknowledgement at all of Jack's loss. It's really wonderful to hear that at some, they're taking it to heart and they're actually making changes and they're acknowledging. That was not our situation.
Jennifer Ruddell reflects on the lack of personal connection and support she experienced from Jack's school after his death. Rather than receiving compassionate acknowledgement, it seemed to her as though the institution wanted to distance itself from the tragedy, leaving the family feeling unsupported and isolated in their grief.
It was distant and quiet. We had the most interaction with the Reverend there, and she's lovely and wonderful and was supportive. But I had questions, and I felt like I wasn't welcome to ask those questions. I wanted to go to the school and get his things. How do I do that? And, you know, he had all of his books and just everything. I gave some to his friends, and I wanted to donate them. Oh, I just took them to their library and left them there. It was just very uncomfortable for me to ask for assistance. And I wanted his brothers to see some of his Oskies, you know.
And what a beautiful memory that would be to have, to see your son actualizing his dream of becoming a physician.
Absolutely.
In that role, knowing how empathic he is, knowing how good he is with people.
Mhm.
What an incredible memory for your family.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that
And
is such a lovely idea.
my request was denied. I was starting to feel embarrassed. And not once was I ashamed or embarrassed. I was traumatized, but my son died by suicide. I understand that. I'm not afraid of sharing that. I want to normalize that talk. I don't know. They weren't comfortable talking about it.
Dr. Muller reflects on the lack of training for handling student suicide, the emotional toll it takes, and the importance of leading with authenticity and vulnerability in the face of tragedy.
I had never had any training or preparation for it, and neither had anyone, frankly, that I'd worked with, which in retrospect is shocking to think of, because we all knew that every once in a while a story would crop up among our colleagues, our peer institutions, and I'll say even more so among undergraduate institutions. I think the rate is probably far higher. So we sort of, all of us know that it was out there, but none of us had had any training on how to manage it or how to manage our own grief, stress, coping with the situation, supporting others. I wish I could say that I had thought it through or planned it out, but I didn't. It was driven by my own fear of not doing it right, of failing people, staff, students, faculty who relied on me to get us through the process. And of course, I mean, it's easy to say relied on me because it was my role, my sort of official title. I think we relied a lot more on each other than on any one person. At the same time, I think groups of people do look to someone, somewhere to set the tone. Sometimes that's the person who's got real positional power, but sometimes it's someone who doesn't have positional power, but has a lot of sort of social influence in a professional setting. Someone has to set the tone. I desperately wanted to do it right for the people I felt were relying on me. And I really needed to do it right for myself as I was trying to sort of desperately process what this meant for me. I needed to be honest with myself too, which was almost harder than to be honest with other people. You know, in medicine, you get so used to patients falling ill, dying. You learn how to manage that well while distancing yourself from it. And I did not want to be that person. I did not want to be that person that once again was able to say, wow, this was terrible. Let me hold your hand, and then go back home and pretend that I could just sort of turn the page and start another day. It just didn't feel right to do that.
Many educators, when faced with the death of a student by suicide, may find themselves unprepared and lacking the necessary tools to respond effectively. Recognizing this gap, Dr. Muller later collaborated with experts, including Dr. Christine Moutier, the Chief Medical Officer of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which created a toolkit called After a Suicide, a Toolkit for Schools. It is designed to guide schools through the aftermath of a suicide, emphasizing a team approach, ensuring that no one person bears the burden alone, and provides vital communication strategies for the grieving process. Dr. Moutier reinforces the importance of being proactive.
A school doesn't face this event every day, thankfully, and the knowledge about mental health and suicide isn't there in a lot of cases. Schools are oftentimes blindsided, and some of them aren't aware of the toolkit for after suicide. Or if they are aware, they're not diving in and utilizing it. It is tough. It's a crisis moment. It's a time when all of our brains are not optimally functioning because we oftentimes do feel caught off guard and are stressed. But the guidance that is in the After Suicide Toolkit really does walk through how to form the right team for what is a crisis moment that requires a well thought out and a team approach. This is not something that, any one person should have to do on their own. It includes the communication steps that need to be taken ideally within the first 24 hours, within the first 3 days. I will say that Postvention toolkit was created by experts in terms of science, lived experience, having experienced loss. I was personally involved with customizing that toolkit for the medical school environment. I think we are becoming more savvy and sort of intelligent in terms of becoming more proactive rather than reactive. And towards the end of the toolkit, there is a kind of a whole section about after a suicide has occurred, many times schools want to jump right into suicide prevention activities. And there actually is a need to allow some time and to go through these really important steps for the community to grieve and kind of process together in a way that is healthier than jumping right into a lecture on self-care and suicide prevention. It's tempting and maybe intuitive to do it that way, but it's not viewed as best practice. There are probably several months that you need to walk through the postvention. And then hopefully schools maintain that momentum of that sense of motivation to prioritize suicide prevention. I also really appreciate and see it exactly the same way that we don't ideally wait for the crisis to occur before we even look at the steps for a proper crisis response. And so that same principle would definitely apply to postvention after suicide.
The AFSP toolkit addresses many concerns following a death by suicide, including how to communicate this to the community. Sometimes the word suicide is avoided after the loss of a trainee or physician at the request of the family. This reluctance, however, can create a silence that leaves students feeling deceived and unsupported. This silence can also perpetuate stigma, making it difficult for individuals to address their feelings and seek help. Dr. Jessi Gold, a psychiatrist, advocate, and author of How Do You Feel, shares her experiences with this language after a loss and how failing to acknowledge these realities can undermine the school's ability to foster a culture of care and compassion.
A lot of times the school knows anyway, and the students know anyway. And then it becomes this complicated lie because nobody's lying because they want to lie. They're lying to protect a family because they were asked to lie. And that makes it hard for the faculty who are trying to hold it. And it makes the students mad. So the students will say, well, we're getting lied to. We know what happened. We heard. We were friends. Somebody knew, et cetera, et cetera. As much as it's hard to not tell the truth for various cultural reasons, for various familial reasons, for various societal reasons, it's even more complicated within sort of the small little society of a school when we can't do that. If a family's not comfortable sharing publicly, but could at least allow the med school to openly talk about it, that would be helpful, because I think the school does struggle. All of them do in different ways. And if they're not coming at it with the same level of information, they're just mad at each other. I've seen a lot of situations that feel more like us against them, or it's this whole thing is the system and they're all broken. And that's a whole mess, I think, in so many ways, instead of being like, this really hard thing happened and it affects all of us because we cared about this person. Let's talk about that. And let's talk about how we make this easier for other people in the future and where you think the issues are and what are we not listening to. It's hard to even get on the same page to have a conversation if it's a silence thing. The silence makes it divisive. Everybody's affected by these things, whether they were their roommate, partner, their best friend, teacher, their mentor, their therapist, their psychiatrist, right? This is a big system of care, and med schools aren't enormous. If somebody was struggling or took time off, or if somebody died, you would know. I think we do need to consider, if we're not comfortable being more open, what it looks like to at least be open in our little system. I think it's important because you can't say people aren't affected. If your friend died of cancer, they'd also be affected. It's your friend. You miss your friend. You want answers that you don't understand. I think suicide has a complex layer to it where we don't talk about it enough, so it doesn't feel like an outcome that should or could happen. When it does happen, it feels like you must have done something wrong, or somebody missed something, or somebody didn't do something. And that's not always the case, right? That's just our reaction because of stigma and society and us not talking about this enough. Instead of saying, like, what can we collectively do to support each other through this really hard time? Of course, you're all struggling. So it is going to have a huge impact on a system, and it should. I mean, it should lead to change, but it shouldn't be the reason for change. I often tell people, if you look around the country, a lot of the places with the most resources spent towards physician well-being, med student well-being, it's because they've had very prominent deaths. They've been in the New York Times. And that shouldn't be how we decide to care. Journalism's super powerful, and I appreciate the use of it in these situations because I do think it brings attention in a way that wouldn't otherwise. It's why I wrote a whole book on this issue, because of the same thing. We're not doing well pretending it's not there. We have to talk about it. That's how things change. But we shouldn't be going, I'm only going to invest in this if people die. We should want to invest in this so we never get to that point, because our lives matter as humans, because we impact other people with our lives in what we're doing. And that's important, because a system can't thrive like that. It just doesn't make sense.
The loss of a medical trainee to suicide can send shockwaves through families, friends, and the medical school community, and it also leaves a lasting impact on fellow students. How do these losses shape the experiences and perspectives of those left behind? What kind of support do they need to navigate their grief while continuing their studies? Roja, Jack's friend and partner, returns to reflect on her experience at school. Her story resonates with the concerns raised by experts about the profound consequences of schools not having clear, compassionate plans in place to support students in the wake of a suicide.
I was the last person to see Jack, at least the last person that he knew well. I had spent the days with him before, and he had left that morning. And some of the last things we said to each other were how much we care about each other and how our friendship is so meaningful. And I love you. And I was shocked. I was completely shocked. I knew that he was having a difficult time with things more generally, and I had messaged a couple of our mutual friends to just go check in on him. It's like, I worry that he might be lonely, so if you guys want to plan a dinner like later in the week, I'm sure that'll be a nice thing. But that was my level of concern. I was in school in Boston, and he was living alone, and it was also the pandemic. Loneliness was definitely something that we all worried about, we were all facing. So I got the call. I honestly blacked out most of that day because it's just so shocking and emotional. What I was able to do is tell one or two of my really close friends that something really horrible had happened and I needed them right now. And those friends came over and they were there with me the entire time, which I am beyond grateful for. Later in the day, I got a call from someone in our med school administration who wasn't sure if I had heard or not, but I presume was about to break the news to me. And I was already a mess. So it was clear I'd heard before they had. Then wanted to talk to me about Jack, express condolences, but then said that we should just make sure that everybody who should know knows, and walked through the list of the students in the medical school that should know. The person had me go through that list of students with her. And then she asked me if I would talk to some of them. and break the news. And I said, how? But my really close friend, Nikki, was there right next to me. And she said, I'll talk to them. I'll call them. There were some people who really should have heard from friends. And we made sure that those 3 or 4 people who were very close friends of Jack were told. I think the support that day was there from the med school in theory and in words. Like, we're here for you, whatever you need. Weeks go by, don't really hear from them. They send out some form email to the student body saying that there are student resources available and that the school therapist who is known to report students for having issues to the administration or put them on watch list is available for conversation. And then there's questions or thoughts around it's a pandemic. How do we do something that honors Jack in the future? At some point, I come back, I think this is the week after he died, I come back to gather with some of my close friends there because we just needed to be around each other. And for the first time, I had just started seeing a therapist a couple of days after Jack had died because there was definitely acute stress disorder and I needed help. I needed a private place to take that therapy call, and I asked if I could do it at the medical school because they have conference rooms, and they said no because it's a pandemic and you're not a currently active student here. But we'll see what someone else might be able to do.
And so to be tasked with breaking the hearts of your classmates, I just can't imagine that pressure.
All I can say is just deep and immense gratitude to my friend Nikki who did that. Because there were people that I'm glad it didn't come from someone who would ask that of the people closest to Jack.
How do you think the school should have responded? Unfortunately, this is something that happens, and I don't know a school that gets it right. I don't know what right is.
I don't know what right is either. But I do know what wrong is.
Tell me.
Wrong is behaviors that feel like you're sweeping something under the rug. Wrong is angling towards protecting your liability as opposed to caring for your students. Wrong is asking the student who just died, closest friend, partner, to plan the memorial for that student and to find the speakers and be in charge of that. Wrong is that my friends who are currently in medical school, who are most of the people who were impacted most closely, had very few touch points or check-ins, that it was all opt-in, that it was business as usual. Wrong is by the time I came back to medical school, because I was away for a different degree, that all of these changes around mental health and wellness were not addressing the root causes, and we're not talking about how scary and isolating and difficult medical school can be, but instead telling students that they needed to be better about mindful eating. Wrong is only reaching out to me 6 months later after Jack had died and asking when and why I hadn't taken my step exam that was originally scheduled for that winter and when my plans to take the exam were. I wasn't sleeping. I was at Harvard getting a business degree, and I can't even begin to say the gratitude I have towards that school for the grace they showed me. Accommodations I didn't even ask for or need, but it just showed up.
Roja's journey highlights the pressing need for institutions to establish thoughtful, empathetic responses during such difficult times. Guidance on these actions are offered in the AFSP Postvention Toolkit. Leaders must set the tone during these events, and communication is critically important, as we hear from Dr. Moutier.
So there's a kind of a sequence of events that should occur, and certainly communication with the family of the person who died by suicide and communication with those peers and others in the community who were close with that student. Those are early communications that should occur, and really sharing information, providing comfort and support, outlining kind of next steps, both practical things as well as memorial services and planning. And then communicating out to the wider community is also a really important step to really inform the community that this tragic loss has occurred and make sure that the resources for mental health support and actually the mitigation steps for contagion are still being taken by that team. This job of the postvention response is really on the leadership of any organization, whether it's a school or a workplace or a faith community.
Schools must also prioritize listening when students raise concerns about inadequate mental health support. Dr. Muller shares his experience after Catherine's death, emphasizing how, despite the discomfort of hearing and accepting such feedback, it is essential for identifying gaps in resources and adapting services to better support the needs of learners.
You feel stupid, you feel helpless. It was awful, awful. And of course, medical schools are relatively small communities. Every single student who stood up there and expressed that rage, I knew exactly who they were. I'd interacted with, on many different levels. It's not some random person coming and wagging their finger at you and telling you you've been terrible. In the moment, I didn't understand what I was doing, but in the moment, I really didn't have anything to say in response. I just literally didn't. At some point I said, I'm sorry, but honestly, I can't even remember that. I literally had nothing to say in response. And it was only years later that I learned that very often you just need to let people say what they want to say. Stop pretending that you're there to fix things. Stop pretending that I understand you. Just stop. Just shut up and let people say what they need to say. They could be completely wrong. They could be partly wrong. It doesn't make a difference. People just need to express what they're feeling, what they're living. And you just need to be quiet and absorb it. You can apologize if you want. There's very, very little that is relevant to express in a moment like that, other than creating a space for people to be angry at you or whatever the moment calls for. But I didn't understand it then. I was in shock. This poor woman had died. I just on and off went on the phone with her parents, for goodness sake. I don't know, hundreds of students in the auditorium, et cetera, et cetera. I was dumbstruck. Thank goodness, because if I'd been a little bit more polished and professional, I would have sounded like a jerk. Oh, thank you for that feedback. We really care so much. Come on. So it was awful.
In the wake of a tragic loss, while caring for our communities, we may unintentionally overlook the needs of the families affected by suicide. In this next segment, the Ruddells reflect on finding the AFSP Postvention toolkit and contrast it with their experiences. They also share invaluable insights into how schools can and should respond in the immediate aftermath and the difficult months following a death by suicide.
I just think the more prepared you are, then the more it might be in the back of your mind, and maybe you'll see something and you'll be able to say something.
It also had the element of disbelief to see that document, that It was protocol, and a very thick, detailed protocol and manual on how to deal with loss by suicide of a medical school student. It was as much on point as it could be. And as I recall, it was dated 2018, 2 years before we lost Jack. And so there was a very strong element of, I guess, anger wouldn't be too strong a word. And it was not unlike looking at the research papers that are done, that are calling this out, the needed change, the statistics. And we've looked at a couple that were so on point and looked at the date of publication as 2016 or 2010. And to understand that this has been out there for so long, this realization, the tangible evidence, the research, and yet there has not been the willingness or the leadership to change. Maybe some programs, maybe some features that can help the wellness and so forth, but meaningful change. And that is just a theme, I think, that we've come to recognize.
And over the course of this series, we're talking not only about the drivers of suicide, but we're talking about what happens in the aftermath. And so even if it is difficult to predict, and even if you can't, say that one particular thing is going to make that change, tip that scale, it took me Googling what to do afterwards to find that document. It wasn't difficult to get to. So that's one element that we've established that can be changed, that medical educators can take that document, they can convene a committee, they can run a series of what ifs, who would be in charge of what, how would we do this. Jennifer, you said, I don't know that the pain will ever go away. I don't know that it will ever heal.
Right.
If the institution that Jack was at were to make actionable change, would that help in the healing?
No, because it's a different pain. I mean, that would make me feel wonderful. It would be very satisfying. And I would feel grateful for the other students because I would never want this to happen to anyone. But the pain is different. It's not anything that anyone can take away. But the level of the pain, it just will always be there. I will always miss him.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
Yes.
A distinction.
I don't know if they were really in tune. It appeared that they were just understaffed. People were doing too many jobs. I would ask Jack, well, have you talked to your advisor or, this person or that? Oh, Mom, I can't, she told me I can't talk to her for another month because she's working on the 4th year's getting residency. So, and I don't want to bother her because if I bother her, then I'll be a pain. I just don't think there is enough staffing. There should be an addendum to the handbook. How do you support the parents? Get a psychiatrist there immediately on site, a therapist, someone, and not necessarily religious. This is a trauma, and there needs to be a program that you can hook them up with. Don't let those parents leave without knowing that you have hooked them up with support and that they've had a conversation with a therapist and that the family has had a conversation as a family with a therapist. People need to learn how to deal with this and how to talk about it. I mean, we're fortunate that we're open people and we're able to discuss it and talk with our family and our loved ones. But a lot of people can't do that.
The healing is not linear.
No.
The trauma.
Just to get through the trauma first. It's not, this isn't even about the healing.
It's trauma, it's a numbness, it's a never-ending search, particularly early on, for did this really happen? It's disbelief, you're short of breath, you can't really function, and in the early stages, you're just going mechanically to do the things that need to be done, but there needs to be a realization that eventually that begins to wear off, that traumatic numbness, if you will. And that is where much of the help is needed because you're no longer running on adrenaline. Mm-hmm. You're suddenly sinking into reality. And how am I going to process this? How am I going to live with this? Mm-hmm. And you begin to realize things, as we've talked about, after the fact that never even occurred to you at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I think the follow-up, the sort of the tactical things to address in the immediate aftermath are very important. And those are covered in the handbook. But I think there needs to be more than that. That's a bare minimum. That's look for the nearest door in case of fire. The much more important part of following up, checking up, mm-hmm. Here's a resource. Right. How are you doing?
Yeah.
There's that. And then I would add there's a third thing, which as a parent is probably among the most important, and that is acknowledging and recognizing that you lost your child. Mm. I think it was 1.5 years. We had not had any reach out. We'd not had any, how are you doing? We're sorry. Maybe some individuals, but that is so important to know that your child's life mattered.
To be disconnected from where your child was, all of a sudden you've brought everything home and you're cut off. It's like, we were used to going there several times a year and used to the neighborhoods and the people and his friends and his professors. And then all of a sudden, not only are we just so cut off from Jack, but you're cut off even from his extended environment, and nobody has reached out to you. That is wrong. You need to reach out, because not only are you suffering this traumatic loss, but you as parents participated.
There needs to be follow-up, and the resources are not immediate. They're longer term as well. And when you think of a community of any type, whether it's a family or it's schoolmates or whatever, it's that continued acknowledgement and follow-up that's so important. Because you do begin to move out of that numb stage, and you're left with something that's just impossibly hard to process and live with. To just have that last 7 years sort of just blacked out, and you're no longer approachable or approached, it just makes it such a stark change.
In this next segment, John and Jennifer Ruddell share their deeply personal reflections on the mental health crisis in medical education, highlighting the devastating loss of life and the concerning rise in these tragedies.
I've certainly referred to this as a crisis, and when I talk to family members or I talk to friends, and I will use that term, and it sort of dawns on me from time to time that one might perceive that this is just, of course, this is a grieving parent that lost a child, and this issue becomes so overpowering that is maybe the way it's characterized. But in fact, it is a crisis. Mm. And you never really have a full opportunity to explain that to people. But it's a crisis because of the things we've talked about. It's a crisis because one life lost, it's just unbearable. It's inexcusable. But if you look at the trends, if you look at how many lives are being lost and the increasing number of lives that are being lost, you cannot call this something other than a crisis. And if you look at conditions that we've come to understand, this stream of energetic, idealistic, intelligent, young and old individuals that are coming through with this vision of helping people, and you look at that and you realize what you're putting them through, and you realize that each of them carry their own layers. That's exponential. And so there is no other description than it being a crisis. And I think that's important for people to understand, that this is not just a throwaway characterization. It's not just overly dramatic. When I use that term, it's from the heart. And it's unfortunately knowing what we've gone through and what others have gone through.
You talk so openly about suicide and your experience. What would you say to the listener, to the parent, to the student, to the institution about talking about it?
Put it on the table. And in the context of an institution, that is putting it out there and talking about it. It is about saying suicide. It's talking about mental health issues, depression, whatever that may be, but it's making it safe. I think that it's also important for parents to have that discussion with their children. It's incredibly important to ask those questions.
To ask direct questions, openly, honestly, and have a discussion.
It can be awkward, and it can be...
That's Jack's word.
Jack would often refer to awkward.
Oh, so
That's
awkward. So it could be an awkward conversation, but a very important one.
But a very important, and that never stopped Jack.
Yeah.
He would have the conversation, and that's the point here, is that at the risk of seeming to distrust your child or to raise something that's very uncomfortable, the cost of not doing that and having a death, it just so far overexceeds any hesitation or discomfort.
Yeah.
The Ruddells discuss the silence that often surrounds conversations about suicide and loss. They emphasize the importance of speaking openly about those we've lost, especially when it comes to remembering the life and joy of their son, Jack. And they encourage others to not shy away from talking about their loved ones. By addressing these difficult topics head-on, they believe we can foster support, connection, and healing.
We talked about how when you lose someone to suicide, people don't know what to say. They don't want to approach you. They don't know what to say. And in the absence of not knowing what to say, they say nothing. And they don't bring up Jack because they're fearful that it will hurt you. But indeed, I could see, Jennifer, how going out to lunch with your friends and having somebody say, oh gosh, it would be Jack's birthday next week. How are you celebrating that? Or do you remember that time the kids all got together? But those stories, those memories,
they're so important.
They bring you joy.
They do.
And to say to the listener, to say to kind of the community, when there is a loss, it doesn't mean we don't talk about this person, that we sweep them under the rug, that we never discuss this.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that we lost them to suicide. They were still your child. They still, as you described, Jack, had this vibrant, energetic, full, rich life that we want to remember.
Yes, it's important. It's important to talk about him and remember him. We just have the best memories now and the best stories shared amongst us. It's so important.
We've been so fortunate that we have wonderful friends and family who are not afraid to talk about Jack. They always have, and they always will. And so we have been fortunate in that we've been able to have an open dialogue and share our feelings. And so many of our friends are just willing to listen. And that's the most important thing to do, is just to be there to listen. Nobody knows what to say. But as parents of someone who has been lost, particularly to suicide, we want to talk about our lost one. There is no risk of evoking some traumatic memory. That trauma is not talking about Jack. And so it's so important to celebrate his life. And that is part of what drives us. This is not something that should be momentarily acknowledged and then passed on. This is important for parents to be able to talk about their child. And so I think a big message is to just reach out to people and just acknowledge your memories or what the loved one meant to you, and acknowledge just how important that person's life was. Mm-hmm. And then just to be there. And that is so important to us. And we've been very fortunate to have that sort of support.
Yeah. You have come together in this experience. You have found little things that are bringing you back to life, back to the joy. And I had asked if you would be willing to share how you were getting through such a difficult experience. I would love for you to share your thoughts and ideas.
It was very, very difficult to find resources. We were in the middle of a pandemic, of course. Ultimately, we found a wonderful doctor whom we Zoomed with through a friend of a friend of a friend. That's how we found it. Because every number we called, every copied paper that we received with numbers, everyone was busy or didn't call back. I mean, it was...
Or just didn't have a background.
Or grief trauma. Because it was complex.
There's so much that will never be understood. And so there will be holes in the logic of what happened, and you'll never be satisfied. So for us, I think it was important to try and process and take some meaning away from this. Part of that is why we want to talk about it. Part of that is
having your grief witnessed.
Well, it's having your grief witnessed. That's a very important thing. And it's sort of finding a purpose in all of this. Mm-hmm. And for us, that is pulling us forward in our path. And I think a big part of that meaning is knowing that Jack didn't want to die, that he fought this. Yeah. And that with no uncertainty, had he lived, he would have been actively engaged in trying to make a difference. Yep. He would be a successful young doctor, amazing compassion and empathy for his patients. But he would very quickly turn to what he saw was a flawed system. Mm-hmm. And he would find a way to get engaged and make a difference. He would find a way to kind of call it out, because that's who Jack was. And so for us to realize that there are very, very few things that you can do. You can't change the past as a survivor. But what we can do is do what Jack can't now do.
Yes.
And so that, I think, has been a very important part of how we've made our way through grief, with some purpose and really understanding, believing that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, but we're also sort of doing it to honor Jack. Mm-hmm. Nobody has the answers. You'll never know the answers, but having somebody just call and say, how are you doing? And listen, that's so important. And speaking about the loved one is so important. But if we didn't have the family and the friends who have just been so tolerant of hearing the same story over and over again, we wouldn't make it through. We are, and we're very fortunate.
John and Jennifer, our time together has been not only an absolute treat, but a privilege. And allowing our group, and me in particular, to hold this space for you, to share Jack's story, is an honor. And I know that it's going to be so helpful for someone listening to this and for the families listening to this. And we normally close our podcasts with advice for the learner that's in the pathway to medicine, or for those that are in medicine, teaching and training the future physicians. For this particular episode, I asked you if you would not mind taking that last word. I think your voice is so important. And so with that, I'd ask you to give your final words to the audience.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and I will try to encapsulate them. I would close by going back to Jack, I think, as a starting point. His life mattered, and what he did during his life was impactful, and we're so proud and grateful for that. His impact will continue to go on, and I say that having heard that from so many, not just as a parent, but so many friends and others have reached out and really spoken of the impact. And similarly, Jack's death matters, his loss. And it's so important for us to also see impact in that and to learn the lessons that teaches us. And in that way, it's honoring Jack. I think we have two things I think that we would sum up with. And the first one is that we're talking about medical education, and med school itself was not the cause of Jack's death. The agony of suicide is that we'll never know. And it's so difficult. But what we do know is that the system of medical education needs to change. The system of medical education is failing our children. It's failing its students. There is no doubt. And those who devote their life to medicine and the care of others in whatever capacity it is deserve to also learn how to take care of themselves, how to have self-compassion, and they need to learn in an environment that is safe. And the mission of medical schools and those within it needs to be to focus on allowing its students to thrive in a safe environment and to leave medical school prepared to be compassionate caregivers. And in order to do that, they themselves need and deserve to be treated that way while they're in med school. The second thing that we would like to leave with, which is very, very important, is that these topics need to just be on the table. The stigmas or the perceptions really need correction when we're talking about any sort of disability. But when we're talking about mental disability, for example, that needs to be an openly discussed topic at med schools. It needs to be embedded in the curriculum, not just programmatic. It needs to be at the core of what is taught, to talk about these things, to talk about disabilities, to talk about depression, anxiety, to talk about suicide risk, suicide prevention, and to talk about suicide itself. That just absolutely has to be openly discussed. And by doing that, I think that you're just creating an environment where it's safer, and you're helping to deflate that stigma. You're helping to kind of redirect people's understanding of what mental disabilities are and other things that for far too long have not been just openly discussed. And so we know that those are things that Jack would want to say as well. And we're just so proud of him and for what he did during his life and just his courage and his grace all the way up to the end. So thank you.
He's really proud of you right now.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity
Yes, it means
share.
the world to us.
As we conclude this episode, it's clear that the impact of losing a student to suicide extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. The experiences shared by educators, students, and families underscore the urgent need for schools to adopt proactive, compassionate responses that prioritize mental health and open communication. By listening to the voices of those directly affected, institutions can foster a supportive environment that not only addresses grief, but also empowers communities to work together in preventing future tragedies. It's a call to action for all leaders in education, to lead with empathy, to be receptive to feedback, and to ensure that no one feels alone in their struggle. We extend our immense thanks to the Ruddells for their partnership in producing this series. Their story, alongside that of their son Jack, serves as a poignant reminder of the changes needed in medical institutions. It's our hope that by sharing their experience, we can inspire a better, more supportive future for all students. While our episodes highlighting the voices of experts on this topic have concluded, listeners are encouraged to tune in to one final episode featuring John and Jennifer Ruddell. In this special installment, they share their reflections on the creation of this series and their hopes for the next steps in addressing these critical issues.
As we conclude today's episode, we once again end with music from Jack Ruddell. Thank you for listening and sharing this special series. We are eternally grateful to our experts, to Roja, and to the Ruddell family. I'd also like to personally thank my co-producers and our consulting psychiatrist. I'm so grateful for this beautiful team spirit. This episode was sponsored by the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. Executive producers of this episode include me, Dr. Lisa Meeks, Riley Betchkel, John and Jennifer Ruddell, and our consulting psychiatrist and narrator, Dr. Joseph Murray. We encourage schools and programs to utilize content from this series for educational purposes in partnership with a mental health professional.
As around the sun, the earth knows she's revolving, and the rosebuds know to bloom in early May. Just as hate knows love's the cure, you can rest your mind assured that I'll be loving you always. As now can't reveal the mystery of tomorrow, but in passing we'll grow older every day. Just as all that's born is new, do know what I say is true, that I'll be loving you always. Till the rainbow burns the stars out in the sky. Always. Till the oceans of us every mountain high. Always. The skies of planets live at sea. Always. Life becomes a tree. Did you know that true love asks for nothing? Her acceptance is the way we pay. Did you know that life is giving love a guarantee to last through forever in another day? Just as time knew to move on since the beginning, and the seasons know exactly when to change. Just as kindness knows no shame, know through all your joy and pain, I'll be loving you always. As the day I know I'm living, but tomorrow could make me the past, but that I mustn't fear. For I know deep in my mind it's love for me I left behind, 'cause I'll be loving you always. Till the day is night and night becomes a Troubles couldn't make you wish you were born in another time and space. But you can bet your lifetimes that and twice is double. That God knew exactly where He wanted you to be placed. So make sure when you say you're in but are not of it, you're not helping to make this earth a place sometimes called hell. Change your words into truth. Change that truth into love. And then maybe our children's grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will say, I've been loving you until the day is night and night becomes the day. Loving you until the trees and seems to suddenly fly away. Loving you until the day that 8 times 8 is 4. Loving you until the day that is the day that are no more.
Until the day the earth starts turning right to left. Until the earth just for the sun denies itself. Until dear Mother Nature says her work is through. Until the day that you are me and I am